Story 2. Jake had always prided himself on being practical. He didn't believe in superstitions or ghosts or anything that couldn't be explained away with logic and reason. That's why, when he moved into the old apartment building on the edge of town, he didn't bat an eye at its age or its worn-down appearance. It was cheap and it was quiet. That was all that mattered. The building creaked and groaned under its own weight. The hallways were dim, the light bulbs flickering at odd intervals. But Jake didn't care. He was used to it. A small studio apartment on the 3rd floor, with a single window that looked out onto a patch of overgrown grass and a small parking lot. He unpacked his things, set up a few bookshelves, and made the place his own. It was the first night that the door caught his attention. At first, it was subtle, a strange, unexplainable shift in the air. A door that he had never noticed before, tucked away at the end of the hallway. It was just a closet, he assumed. There was no real reason to think anything of it. But when he passed by it the next day, it was ajar. Just a few inches, enough to catch his eye. Jake shrugged it off. It was an old building. Doors got stuck, or the wind could push them open. No big deal. But it didn't sit right with him. The door had been perfectly closed when he first moved in. Days passed, and each time Jake walked down the hallway, he noticed the door more and more. It was always slightly open, never wide enough for him to see inside, but enough to spark his curiosity. The subtle scraping sound of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years made the door seem almost alive. One evening, after a long shift at work, Jake returned to find the door wider than usual, almost as if it were inviting him inside. His heart rate quickened, a strange sense of urgency pressing against his chest. He approached it cautiously, his hand resting just above the handle. What was this? Was someone messing with him? He turned the handle, the door creaking loudly in the otherwise silent hallway. Inside was just a small closet. It looked perfectly ordinary. Shelves lined one wall, and there was an old broom leaning against the corner. A few boxes of forgotten items gathered dust in the back, but nothing seemed out of place. Jake stood there for a moment, wondering why he'd even bothered to check. His skin prickled as though he were being watched. He shut the door with a firm push, the soft click of it locking into place echoing down the hallway. But something didn't sit right. The following nights were marked by strange noises. It started as the faintest scratching sound, almost like nails dragging across a surface, coming from behind the door. Jake dismissed it as rats in the walls or some kind of pest, but the sound continued, growing louder each night. The first time he heard it, he tried to ignore it. He tried to sleep, but the noise kept him awake. It was rhythmic, unnatural. A scrape, pause, pause. It was enough to make his skin crawl. The next day, he found himself standing in front of the door again. The scratching had stopped, but the door was slightly ajar once more, just as it had been before. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for him to do something. Jake's curiosity got the better of him. He reached for the handle again, pushing the door open slowly. The same closet. But now, there was a difference. A faint smell lingered in the air, a sour, musty odor that made him wrinkle his nose. It wasn't the smell of old wood or mildew. It was something deeper, more pungent, like something that had been left forgotten for years. He stepped inside, feeling the weight of the room shift around him. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed something odd about the far wall. There was a mark, scratches, deep gouges carved into the wood. Not just from the outside, but inside the closet itself, as if something, or someone, had been desperately trying to escape. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel his pulse in his temples, the adrenaline rushing through his veins. The scratching, it wasn't just random. Someone had tried to break out. Just a mistake, Jake muttered to himself, trying to rationalize it. It's an old building. It's falling apart. That's all. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There was something more to this. Something dark. He stepped back into the hallway, shutting the door once more. The air felt heavy. The silence felt heavier. Jake glanced up and down the corridor, half expecting to see someone watching him from the stairwell or the other apartments. But there was nothing. He made his way back to his apartment, his mind racing. Could he be imagining things? Or was he just letting his mind run wild in an old, unfamiliar space? He needed to forget about the door. He needed to stop focusing on it. But that night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again. The scratching. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was an undeniable presence, something lurking in the dark, something waiting. Jake tossed and turned, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The sound was coming from the door again, louder this time, like it was right behind him. Every part of his brain screamed at him to get up, to investigate, to figure out what was going on, but the fear rooted him to the bed. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, he went to the building's maintenance office and asked about the door. He was met with a strange look from the old janitor, who didn't say much at first. Finally, after a long pause, he grumbled, "That closet? It's been there for years. Don't mess with it, kid." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The janitor glanced over his shoulder, as though checking to see if anyone was listening, before leaning in closer. "The last guy who messed with it, well, he never came back. People say it's locked for a reason." Jake's blood ran cold. A reason? What was the janitor talking about? The last guy? His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the cryptic warning. Who had disappeared? What was in that closet? He left the office, his mind racing. The scratching returned that night, louder than ever, as if something, or someone, was calling out for help. And that was when Jake realized some doors were meant to stay locked. Jake couldn't shake the image of the scratches inside the closet. The deeper he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Someone had been locked in there, trying to get out. That was the only explanation that made sense. But why hadn't anyone else said anything about it? Why had the janitor reacted so strangely when he asked about the door? The night was the hardest. He lay in bed, the shadows in the room stretching long and dark, his mind replaying the sounds, the scratches, the whispers, the eerie stillness of the apartment. Each time the clock ticked past midnight, the sounds grew louder, the pressure in the room thicker. It had to be the wind, right? Jake clenched his jaw, turning over, pulling the blankets tighter around his body. But the sound didn't stop. The scratching wasn't in the walls. It was from behind the door, from inside the closet. The room was silent for a moment, and then it began again, a faint, dragging sound, like nails scraping across wood. With a curse, Jake threw the covers off and swung his legs over the side of the bed. He knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. The house wasn't going to let him. He grabbed his flashlight from the desk and walked into the hallway. The door at the end of the corridor stood slightly ajar, just as it always had. This time, Jake didn't hesitate. He wasn't sure if it was bravery or madness driving him, but his hand reached for the cold doorknob. The metal felt strangely warm under his touch, like it had been waiting for him. He turned the handle. The door creaked open with a low groan, the hinges protesting like an old man waking from a long sleep. The musty smell from before hit him instantly, the scent of decay, of something forgotten. It was stronger now, almost suffocating. He stepped inside. The flashlight beam swept across the small space, illuminating the dusty shelves, the forgotten boxes, the rusted broom in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. Everything appeared just as it had the last time he'd been here. But the silence was different. It was thicker, oppressive. The shadows in the corner seemed to move, curling away from the light as if they had a life of their own. And then he saw it again. The scratches. They were deeper now, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. The grooves in the wood were jagged, their edges raw and rough, like they had been made in a frenzy. They ran along the walls and down to the floor. The closet was small, but it felt too big now, too large for the space it should have occupied. Jake crouched down, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the marks. The air around him seemed to shift, the temperature dropping. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. Something had happened in this room, something terrible. He stood up quickly, backing away, but the flashlight flickered. For a brief moment, the light caught something in the far corner, something he hadn't noticed before. A chair. It was old, with a weathered wooden frame, but what struck him was the position. It was placed directly in front of the wall, facing it. There was no reason for it to be there, no explanation for why someone would sit and face a wall, completely still, for any length of time. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He stepped forward, the beam of light shaking in his hand as he inspected the chair. It was bolted to the floor. Solid. Unmovable. Jake's chest tightened. The scratching noise returned, louder now, like fingernails against a chalkboard. But this time, it wasn't from the walls. It was coming from inside the chair. From behind it. He took a hesitant step back, his mind racing. What was making the noise? "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small in the empty room. Nothing. The scratching stopped. A silence settled over the room again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your skin, the kind that made you feel like you weren't alone, even when you were. Jake turned and bolted for the door. He didn't stop to think, didn't waste time wondering what the hell he had just seen. He yanked the door open, stumbling into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The door slammed shut behind him. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the chair staring at the wall haunted him. And every time he opened his eyes, the silence in the apartment felt like a weight pushing down on him. The next morning, he called the landlord. He didn't know why he was doing it, but something inside him told him to ask about the apartment's past, about the strange door, and the man who had lived there before him. He needed answers. The phone rang twice before the landlord picked up. "Hello?" the raspy voice said, followed by a series of coughing fits. "Hi, this is Jake, from apartment 3B. I have a few questions about the building." The landlord cleared his throat. "What about?" "There's a door in the hallway, an old closet. It's been acting strange. Can you tell me anything about it?" There was a long pause on the other end. Jake could hear the sound of shuffling papers, the rustle of fabric. When the landlord spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. "That closet. That door hasn't been opened in years. Why?" Another pause. This time, the landlord's voice trembled. "It's been locked for a reason. The last person who lived there, he went missing. No one knows where he went, but he didn't leave through the front door. People say he was trying to get out through that closet. They found marks on the walls, scratches, like he was trying to claw his way out." Jake's stomach dropped. "What happened to him?" The landlord didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They never found him. He just vanished." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean, vanished?" "I mean, he was here one day. The next day, gone. No trace. Nothing. The door's been locked ever since." Jake slammed the phone down, his hand shaking. The images of the closet, the chair, the scratches, it all came rushing back. The man who had lived here before him had disappeared. But why? Why had he been trying to get out? And what if Jake was next? Jake barely slept after the conversation with the landlord. His mind raced, turning over the words he'd heard. The last person who lived there, he went missing. The apartment, the door, the scratches, everything was connected in some way, and Jake couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to understand what had happened. He had to know what he was dealing with before it consumed him completely. But as the night dragged on, an uncomfortable thought gnawed at him. What if the man who disappeared hadn't just vanished? What if he had become trapped, just like the others? The next day, Jake called in sick to work. He didn't want to leave the apartment. He had no real plan, but something inside him told him he couldn't let this go. The door had been locked for a reason, and the scratching noises? They weren't just from an old house settling. He'd felt it. He knew there was something in that room, something alive. By noon, Jake was standing in front of the closet door again, flashlight in hand. The sunlight streaming through the hallway was dimming as clouds rolled in, casting an eerie gray light over everything. The door was as he left it, slightly ajar. He didn't hesitate this time. His fingers tightened around the handle, and he pulled it open with one swift motion. The smell hit him first, the mustiness, the stale air, mixed with something darker, more foul. His stomach churned, but he couldn't turn back now. He stepped inside. The closet hadn't changed since last night. The chair was still in the center, bolted to the floor. The gouges in the wall were still there, deeper now, as if something had been trying to claw its way out, but had failed. But now, there was something else. A new scratch. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The fresh gouge in the wood was wider, jagged, and ran along the edge of the chair's base. The marks were uneven, as though they'd been made by desperate hands. His gaze flicked to the floor around the chair. Small, dried clumps of what looked like hair were scattered on the floor. He bent down to inspect them, his hands trembling. The clumps were soft, brittle, but unmistakably hair. Human hair. The flashlight slipped from his grip, clattering against the floor. He stood up quickly, his chest tightening. He knew now. Whatever had happened in this room wasn't just some accident. It wasn't just a man who'd gone mad. This room had been used for something dark. And he was standing in the middle of it. A thump echoed from behind him. It was soft at first, like a knock, but then it grew louder, more urgent, like something was trying to break through. Jake spun around, but the room was empty. The scratching began again, but this time it wasn't from the walls. It was coming from the chair. "No," Jake whispered, stepping back. "No, no, no." The chair shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it moved. His heart hammered in his chest, and his instincts screamed at him to run. But his legs were frozen, like they were made of lead. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the chair. The air was thick with tension. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. The silence was suffocating. And then it came. A voice. Soft, almost inaudible at first. "Help me!" Jake's blood ran cold. His throat tightened, and he couldn't speak. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. The voice was coming from the chair, from the same spot where the hair had fallen. "Please!" The voice was weak, desperate, as though it had been trapped for years. You have to let me out." Jake stumbled backward, his hand gripping the doorframe as he tried to regain his composure. He could feel the weight of something pressing down on him, something suffocating, drowning him in fear. "Who are you?" he managed to croak, his voice raw. I was here, a long time ago." The voice grew weaker, strained. "I tried to get out, but they kept me here." Jake's mind raced. Who was it? Who had been locked in this room? What did they want? He stepped closer, drawn by the voice, even though every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave. He reached for the chair, his fingers brushing against the cold, splintered wood. The moment his hand made contact, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the air grew colder, and the floor beneath him seemed to crack. The chair jerked, snapping back to its original position. Jake stumbled, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. He backed away from it, his pulse racing, but the voice came again, louder this time. "I'm sorry," the voice whispered, almost in a gasp. "I didn't want this. I didn't want it to happen to you." Suddenly, everything went still. The room was silent. The air, thick with tension just moments ago, had now stilled, but Jake knew it wasn't over. The voice had warned him, but he couldn't understand. What was it trying to say? What had happened to him? The door slammed shut behind him. Jake jumped, his head snapping toward it, but the door was locked. He had closed it. He was trapped in the closet, just like the man before him, just like the others. The scratching resumed. Louder this time. Faster. Closer. Jake's eyes darted around the room. His mind raced. He had to get out. He had to break free before whatever force was in this room consumed him. His hand found the knob, and he twisted it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. The door refused to open, mocking him with its cold resistance. "No!" Jake muttered, panicked. He pulled harder, desperation seeping into his every movement. "Please!" The light above flickered. Then, something grabbed his shoulder. He whirled around, but no one was there. But there was a sound. A low, guttural whisper, almost as if something was laughing from the darkness. Jake screamed, pushing against the door with all his strength, but the chair was in his way. The wall seemed to close in, pressing against him, as the laughter grew louder, distorted. "You'll stay here," the voice crooned, "just like the others. Forever." And then, the door cracked open. Jake barely had time to step back before he was engulfed in darkness. Jake's chest tightened as the door creaked open, inching back slowly, as if inviting him to step deeper into the nightmare he had unwillingly stepped into. His fingers trembled at the edge of the knob. The room felt colder, denser. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, the oppressive silence pressing in around him. It was as if the house itself was waiting. The light above flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the room, twisting the corners into something grotesque. Every inch of his body screamed for him to run, but he couldn't tear himself away from the doorway. He had already come too far. The scratching had stopped, but the unease remained, lingering like a thick fog. He stepped inside the closet once again, his shoes scraping against the floor with every hesitant step. The air felt wrong, thick and humid, as if the room itself was suffocating him. The chair was still there, bolted to the floor. The scratches in the walls had deepened overnight, now jagged and erratic, tracing paths that looked like they had been made in desperation. Jake approached the chair, his body tense, his hand hovering over the backrest. It felt as though the chair was watching him, waiting. The weight of the room seemed to shift, becoming more oppressive the closer he got to it. Every instinct in him screamed to leave, to never look back, but he couldn't. The whisper started again, faint at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with every passing second. "Help me!" Jake's breath hitched. It wasn't the same voice he'd heard the night before. This voice was different, angrier, more insistent. "You have to listen." Jake stood frozen, his body stiff with terror. His eyes darted around the closet, but there was no one there. The air was thick with the same suffocating presence, the same oppressive force that had filled the room every time he stepped inside. "Please let me go," the voice begged, almost a whisper, yet clear as day. "You don't understand. You don't know what it is to be trapped here." Jake's pulse quickened. His hand trembled as he reached for the chair. There was a tremor in the wood beneath his fingers, like the chair itself was alive, responding to his touch. He leaned forward slowly, unwillingly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice raw with fear. The words felt stupid as soon as they left his lips. It didn't matter. He needed to know. He needed to understand what was happening to him. "I was the one before you," the voice replied, the words slow and deliberate. "The one who sat in the chair. I tried to leave, but I couldn't. None of us can." A shiver ran down Jake's spine. The words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, but his feet felt glued to the floor. His chest tightened with panic. "What do you mean?" he gasped. "Who's US? Who are you talking about?" The room seemed to contract with each word. The walls, the air, the shadows, they closed in around him. The chair creaked ominously, and Jake could have sworn the scratching noise began again, louder, faster, as if something was trying to break free. "The ones who were trapped in here before you," the voice whispered, its tone now darker, almost mocking. "The ones who thought they could leave. The ones who failed." Jake's blood ran cold. His hands clenched into fists, but his body refused to move. His heart hammered in his chest. He was beginning to understand. Whatever had happened to the man who lived in this apartment before him, whatever had driven him to claw at the walls, had been a fate Jake was now facing. And if he didn't escape, if he didn't figure out what had happened, he would become just another part of the room's endless cycle. I can't stay here," Jake muttered, his voice cracking. He turned back toward the door, his legs shaking. "I can't." But as his fingers touched the doorknob, the temperature dropped. His breath froze in the air. The door slammed shut, and the force knocked him back, sending him crashing to the floor. His head hit the ground with a sickening thud. Dizzy, he struggled to his feet, his hand still gripping the door, but the knob wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself had locked him in, trapping him in the very room he had tried to escape. "You can't leave," the voice crooned, a cruel laugh echoing in the corners of the room. "No one leaves. Not once they've seen the truth." The air around him grew thick with tension, as if something unseen was pressing in on him. The closet felt smaller now, the shadows darker. He could hear the sound of scratching coming from every direction, on the walls, on the floor, on the very air around him. Jake pounded on the door, screaming in frustration and terror. "Let me out! Let me out!" His voice cracked with desperation. But the door didn't open. It never would. The chair shifted again, scraping against the floor as if it were alive, and Jake knew, without a doubt, that he was now part of whatever twisted force had bound this place together. He backed away from the door, gasping for air. His eyes darted around, searching for any way out, but the room was closing in. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him. "You'll stay here," the voice said, its tone sadistic. "Just like the others. Forever." Jake collapsed to the floor, his head spinning. The room had become too small, too suffocating. The chair in the center of the room had taken on a new, ominous presence. It wasn't just a chair anymore. It was a throne of torment, a prison that he had unwillingly stepped into. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. And then, the voice spoke again, clearer now, almost triumphant. "Welcome to your new home.